A single mother was about to lose her job for an act of kindness, and she had no idea it would save her life. The city awoke that morning under a steel-grey sky, weeping a relentless drizzle that turned the streets into slick, black mirrors. For Clara, the rhythmic thump of her windshield wipers was a frantic metronome counting down the seconds to her professional demise. Gripping the worn steering wheel of her aging sedan, she navigated the choked arteries of downtown traffic, her heart pounding in sync with the car's sputtering engine. She was already late, teetering on the edge of a final warning from a manager who valued punctuality over everything, including the harsh realities of raising a child alone in a city that never slept and rarely forgave. Through the rain-streaked glass, a scene of desperation snagged her attention, a small island of chaos in the river of indifferent commuters. A man, his clothes soaked through and clinging to his frame, stood beside a stalled vehicle, waving his arms with a wild, almost primal urgency. He looked utterly helpless, a stark contrast to the powerful, self-assured figures who usually strode these sidewalks. Horns blared around him as other drivers swerved impatiently, their faces tight with the singular focus of getting to their own destinations. He was just another obstacle in their path, a problem to be avoided, a footnote in their busy morning. But Clara saw something more in his frantic eyes, a raw, unfiltered panic that resonated with her own quiet struggles. A fierce internal battle raged within her. The glowing red numbers on her dashboard clock seemed to mock her, each passing minute a step closer to the unemployment line. She could almost hear her manager's cold, clipped words from their last meeting. "This is your absolute final chance, Clara. No more excuses." The image of her son's trusting face flashed in her mind, a powerful reminder of the bills on her counter and the fragile stability she fought for every single day. Helping this stranger wasn't just a delay, it was a guaranteed catastrophe. It meant sacrificing the one thing that kept a roof over their heads. The logical part of her brain screamed at her to keep driving, to merge back into the anonymous flow and save herself. Yet, as she watched him, his shoulders slumping in defeat after another car sped past, her conscience refused to be silenced. It was a quiet but persistent voice, the one that had guided her through every hardship, the one that defined who she was, beyond a struggling employee and a tired mother. It spoke of shared humanity, of the unspoken pact to help one another in moments of true crisis. In his desperate plea, she saw a reflection of every time she had felt alone and overwhelmed, wishing for a single hand to reach out. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Clara flicked on her turn signal, a small act of defiance against the cold logic of survival. The decision felt both reckless and profoundly right. She pulled her car to the curb, the sound of her tires on the wet pavement sealing her choice. As she rolled down her window, the damp city air filled her car, carrying the scent of rain and exhaust. "Sir, do you need some help?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The man rushed over, his face a mess of relief and anxiety. "My wife," he gasped, his words a desperate torrent. "She's in labor. We were on our way to the hospital, and the car just died." He pointed a shaking finger toward the distant skyline. Clara looked from his pleading, terrified eyes back to the clock. In that moment, she felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Certain that her compassion had just cost her everything, she had no way of knowing this was not an ending, but the beginning of it all. The man's desperate plea hung in the air, a stark and undeniable truth that sliced through Clara's own anxieties. "She's in labor." The words echoed in the cramped space of her car, instantly reframing her dilemma. This was no longer about a stalled engine or a minor inconvenience. It was about the imminent arrival of a new life, a sacred and terrifying moment that waited for no one. The glowing red numbers on her dashboard now seemed insignificant, a trivial concern in the face of such raw human need. She imagined the woman, somewhere in that stalled car, frightened and in pain, and the image solidified her resolve. The cold voice of her manager faded, replaced by the louder, more insistent voice of her own conscience. With a final decisive nod to herself, she met the man's pleading gaze. "Get in," she said, her voice a quiet command. "Hurry!" He scrambled into the passenger seat, bringing with him the scent of rain and a palpable aura of panic. Water dripped from his simple jacket onto the worn fabric of the seat as he slammed the door shut, the sound punctuating the end of Clara's old life and the beginning of this new, uncertain path. He gasped the name of the nearest hospital, his hand trembling as he pointed vaguely through the deluge. Clara didn't hesitate. She pulled away from the curb with a lurch, merging recklessly into the unforgiving stream of traffic. Her focus narrowed to a single point: the hospital. Every honking horn, every impatient driver flashing their lights became background noise in her mission. She was no longer just a commuter. She was a chariot driver in a race against time, fueled by a stranger's fear and her own defiant compassion. The journey was a blur of smeared city lights and the relentless rhythm of the wipers. Beside her, the man fumbled with his phone, his voice breaking as he tried to soothe the person on the other end. "I'm on my way, honey. I promise. A woman, an angel, is driving me." Clara overheard fragments of their conversation, intimate whispers of reassurance and shared terror that made her feel like an intruder in the most profound moment of their lives. Yet, it also connected her to them in a way she couldn't explain. She thought of the day her own son was born, the overwhelming mix of fear and joy, and a wave of empathy washed over her. This man's panic was her panic. His wife's struggle was a struggle she understood deep in her bones. This was no longer a choice. It was a shared human experience. As the imposing structure of the hospital loomed into view, a stark white beacon against the grey sky, the man's frantic energy softened into profound gratitude. He turned to her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't know how I can ever repay you," he stammered, his gaze falling on the faded photo of her son tucked into the sun visor. "You saved us. My name is Arthur Harrison." He reached for his wallet, but Clara gently shook her head, a weary but genuine smile touching her lips. "Just take care of your wife," she said, her voice soft. The thought of money felt insulting. The price she was about to pay for this act couldn't be measured in dollars, and in that moment, she accepted it. She knew with chilling certainty that she had traded her job for this stranger's peace of mind. She screeched to a halt directly in front of the emergency room entrance, ignoring the signs and the disapproving glare of a security guard. Time had run out. "Go!" she urged, her voice stronger now, filled with a sense of finality. "Don't waste another second." Arthur, Mr. Harrison, gave her one last searching look, an expression of immense gratitude etched onto his face before he bolted from the car and vanished through the automatic doors. Clara watched him go, a lone figure swallowed by the urgent, sterile world of the hospital. Then she was alone again in the rain-streaked silence of her car. The engine hummed, a faithful companion to her solitude. She took a single, deep breath, put the car in drive, and turned toward her office to face the inevitable end of her career. The dismissal was as swift and impersonal as the city itself. Clara walked into the sterile, fluorescent-lit office, her clothes still damp, her hair clinging to her forehead. Her manager, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a state of mild disapproval, didn't even ask for an explanation. He simply pointed to the clock on the wall, its hands forming a perfect, damning accusation. The words, "We have to let you go," were delivered with the same flat intonation he used to announce quarterly targets. There was no room for the story of a frantic father or a baby's imminent arrival. In this world of spreadsheets and deadlines, human drama was an inefficient, unacceptable variable. As she quietly packed the few personal items from her desk, a coffee mug, a wilted plant, a small, framed photo of her smiling son, a profound sense of isolation washed over her. She had chosen humanity over punctuality, and her punishment was this cold, silent exile. That evening, the crushing weight of her decision settled in. The tiny apartment, usually a warm sanctuary from the world's harsh edges, felt like a cage. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant wail of a siren, seemed to mock her new, terrifyingly uncertain future. She sat with her son at their small kitchen table, pushing food around her plate, her appetite gone. He chattered happily about his day at school, blissfully unaware of the storm raging inside her. When she tucked him into bed, he wrapped his small arms around her neck and asked, "Mommy, why are your eyes so sad?" She forced a bright, brittle smile, assuring him she was just tired. But as she closed his bedroom door, the facade crumbled. The image of Arthur Harrison's desperate face warred with the image of the eviction notice she now feared was inevitable. Had her single act of compassion been a terrible, unforgivable mistake? 2 days later, as she was listlessly scrolling through online job postings, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Her first instinct was to ignore it, assuming it was another bill collector, but something compelled her to answer. A man's voice, quiet and thick with emotion, cautiously asked if he was speaking to the owner of a grey sedan. It was Arthur. The raw panic was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant gratitude that seemed to warm the air around her. He told her that his wife had given birth to a beautiful, healthy baby girl just moments after he arrived at the hospital. He explained they had decided to name her Grace because it was by an act of sheer grace that they had made it there at all. A tear slid down Clara's cheek, not of sadness, but of a sudden, overwhelming sense of rightness that momentarily erased all her fear. During their conversation, Arthur's tone shifted, a note of concern entering his voice as he asked if she had managed to get to work on time that morning. Clara hesitated, not wanting to burden this stranger with her problems, but the truth tumbled out in a quiet, resigned rush. She told him she had been fired. A profound silence stretched across the line, a void filled with his unspoken shock and her weary acceptance. He began to stammer, insisting this was not right, that he had to do something to repay her, that he couldn't live with the knowledge that his family's joy had cost her so dearly. His promises felt both sincere and strangely vague, as if he were wrestling with a problem far more complex than simple reimbursement. He ended the call by saying he would be in touch very soon, leaving Clara with a lingering sense of mystery. Days turned into a week, and the hope ignited by Arthur's call began to dim. The silence from his end felt like a final, gentle rejection. She concluded that his promise had been a fleeting sentiment, a kind thought swallowed by the overwhelming demands of a newborn and a new life. He was a man who had moved on, and she was just a footnote in his story. Resigned, she dedicated herself to the grim task of job hunting, her heroic moment on that rainy street feeling more distant and dreamlike with each passing hour. It was on a bleak Friday afternoon, as she was about to give up for the day, that an unexpected email landed in her inbox. The sender was from the highest level of corporate administration at her former company. The subject line was stark and unnerving: mandatory final review. A cold dread, mixed with utter confusion, crept up her spine. Why would they want to see her now? The walk to the corporate headquarters felt like a final, humiliating pilgrimage. Clara entered a lobby of polished marble and cold, intimidating steel, a world away from the cubicle farm where she had worked. She felt small and out of place, her simple clothes a stark contrast to the sharp suits and confident strides of the people who passed her by without a second glance. An assistant with a practiced, impersonal smile led her to an elevator that ascended in unnerving silence. Each floor a step further into a realm of power she couldn't comprehend. She clutched her worn handbag, her knuckles white, her mind racing through 1,000 dreadful possibilities. Was she being sued? Had she somehow violated a company policy in her departure? The summons felt less like a review and more like a final judgment, a formal condemnation of the compassion that had already cost her so dearly. She was guided into a vast corner office, a space so large it seemed to have its own atmosphere. One entire wall was a sheet of glass, offering a godlike view of the rain-washed city below, the same streets where her fate had been sealed. A man stood with his back to her, gazing out at the sprawling metropolis, his silhouette framed by the grey light. He was perfectly still, a figure of immense and quiet authority. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This had to be the CEO, the faceless titan at the top of the corporate ladder. She waited, her breath caught in her throat, for him to turn and deliver the final blow. But the silence stretched on, filled only by the distant hum of the city and the storm of her own anxieties. The man did not move, seemingly lost in the view, or perhaps in a memory that the city's panorama had stirred within him. The truth was, Arthur Harrison was not just looking at the city. He was seeing a ghost from his past. Nearly a decade earlier, on a different rain-slicked street, he had been another man. He was younger, less wealthy, and filled with a desperate, hopeful terror as he rushed his first wife to the hospital. Their car, much like the one last week, had sputtered and died, leaving them stranded in a sea of cold, rushing indifference. He had stood in the rain, just as he had done recently, waving his arms and begging for help from the anonymous faces behind passing windshields. But no one had stopped. Not one person had broken from the rhythm of their own lives to acknowledge his panic. They had lost the baby that day, and in the quiet, sterile grief of the hospital, a part of him had died too, replaced by a deep, hollow cynicism about the true nature of human kindness. That cynical armor had been his constant companion for years, even as he built a corporate empire. He saw that same self-serving indifference in boardrooms, in market strategies, and in the very culture of the company he ran. A place where a rigid manager could fire a struggling mother for being a few minutes late. When his car broke down with his new wife in labor, it was more than a coincidence. It was a cruel reenactment of his greatest trauma. The same rain, the same helplessness, the same river of uncaring commuters. He had braced himself for the same heartbreaking outcome, his soul crying out for just one person to prove him wrong. And then Clara's car had pulled over. Her simple question, "Do you need some help?" wasn't just an offer of a ride. It was a miraculous answer to a decade-old prayer, a single light that pierced through his long, dark night of disbelief. Finally, the man turned from the window, his movement slow and deliberate. The face that met Clara's gaze was no longer that of a frantic, rain-soaked stranger. He was composed, his simple jacket replaced by an impeccably tailored suit that bespoke immense wealth and power. Yet his eyes were the same. They held the raw, unfiltered emotion she remembered from the side of the road, a mixture of profound gratitude and a deep, soul-shaking sorrow. He looked at her, the woman who had unknowingly restored his faith in humanity. The employee whose quiet compassion had shined a light on the darkness within his own organization. He had found the one person who embodied the values he now realized were missing from his life and his company. But what he didn't know is that fate was about to deliver its own verdict. Clara's world narrowed to the space between them, the air crackling with an unspoken tension that was both familiar and terrifyingly new. As he turned, the pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place with a brutal, disorienting force. It was him. The same desperate eyes, the same line of his jaw now set with a quiet authority she hadn't recognized in his panic. The frantic, rain-soaked man from the roadside was gone, replaced by a figure of immense power, standing in the heart of the corporate machine that had just spit her out. Her mind recoiled, refusing to connect the two realities. This man, Arthur Harrison, was not just a grateful new father. He was the owner of this building, the master of this universe, the ultimate source of the cold, impersonal policy that had declared her obsolete. A wave of vertigo washed over her, and she instinctively took a step back, her hand flying to her throat as if to stop a gasp from escaping. "Please, have a seat," he said, his voice no longer the ragged plea of a desperate husband, but a calm, resonant baritone that commanded the vast space of the office. The sound of it, so controlled and measured, was more jarring than a shout. He gestured toward an elegant leather chair, but Clara's legs felt rooted to the plush carpet. Her brain was a maelstrom of conflicting images. This man, drenched and helpless on the curb, and this same man, now a titan of industry framed by a panoramic view of the city he seemingly owned. The nameplate on the expansive mahogany desk read, "Arthur Harrison, CEO." The truth was an impossible, undeniable weight pressing down on her. The man whose family she had saved was the same man whose company had just destroyed her life. The irony was so cruel, so profound, it stole the air from her lungs. He seemed to understand her paralysis, his gaze softening with an empathy that felt entirely out of place in this cold, corporate sanctum. "I know this must be confusing," he began, his eyes holding hers, creating an intimate island in the middle of the cavernous room. "When you stopped for me, Clara, you didn't just give me a ride. You showed me something I thought was extinct, especially within the walls of this company." He walked slowly toward his desk, not sitting but leaning against it, bridging the distance between them. "I've spent years building an empire on efficiency and results, but I forgot to build it with heart. Your manager was following my rules. Rules that I now see are fundamentally broken. Your compassion, your willingness to sacrifice your own security for a complete stranger. That is a quality I value more than punctuality." The words washed over Clara, each one chipping away at the foundation of her reality. She was not here to be punished further. This was not a final condemnation. It was something else, something she couldn't yet comprehend. Her mind, which had been bracing for impact, was now completely adrift in a sea of shock. The anger she expected to feel was absent, replaced by a dizzying sense of unreality. He was the CEO. She had been fired for helping him. He had summoned her here, to the very top of the tower, to tell her that her act of kindness was valuable. It didn't make sense. The world she knew operated on a simple, brutal logic. Rules were rules, and compassion was a liability. This man was speaking a language she didn't understand, rewriting the laws of her universe right before her eyes. He pushed himself off the desk and took a step closer, his expression earnest, his gaze unwavering. The power he projected was not intimidating, but transformative. "I didn't bring you up here to apologize for my manager's decision, Clara. He was only a symptom of a much larger problem. A problem I created." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle in the silent room. Then he delivered the line that shattered her world completely, turning it inside out and upside down. "I didn't summon you to give you your old job back," he stated, his voice clear and resolute. "I brought you here because I need you to help me change the soul of this entire company." Clara could only stare, speechless, as the city sprawled behind him, a silent witness to the moment her destiny had been irrevocably rewritten. Instead of relief, a sheet of ice seemed to form over Clara's features. The shock that had held her captive moments before now solidified into a quiet, profound sense of violation. His words, meant to be a balm, felt like a branding iron, marking her act of pure compassion with the insignia of his corporate world. She wasn't an angel of mercy anymore. She was a potential asset, a case study in company values. The vast, luxurious office suddenly felt suffocating, the panoramic view a mocking testament to the chasm between their realities. He had experienced a moment of panic, but she had faced the abyss of total ruin. His grand offer didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like a transaction. A powerful man settling a debt with a gesture that, for him, was effortless, while for her, it was a redefinition of her entire identity. The warmth in her chest from helping him was extinguished, replaced by a cold, protective pride. Clara finally looked at him, her gaze clear and steady, devoid of the gratitude he had so clearly anticipated. A single, contained tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was a tear of indignation, not joy. "I didn't help you because I was looking for a promotion," she said, her voice barely a whisper yet cutting through the silence of the office with the sharpness of glass. "I helped you because you were a man whose wife was in labor, and you were terrified. That's all it was." She took a small, steadying breath, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. "For you, it was a moment of crisis. For me, it was a choice that cost me the roof over my son's head. You can't just erase that with a job offer. You can't package my humanity and put it on your company's letterhead." The injustice of it all was a bitter taste in her mouth. Her kindness had been pure, and now it felt tainted by his power. Arthur Harrison stood frozen, the confident CEO persona dissolving to reveal the vulnerable man she had first met. He had anticipated every possible business outcome, every market fluctuation, but he had never anticipated this quiet, dignified rejection. He saw now that he had framed his offer in the only language he truly knew, the language of corporate solutions and strategic value. He hadn't offered a hand to a fellow human. He had offered a position to a promising candidate. He opened his mouth to explain, to tell her about his first wife, about the decade of cynicism she had shattered, but the words felt hollow even to him. How could he explain the depth of his gratitude without it sounding like the condescending charity of a billionaire? He was trying to honor her, but he was only succeeding in cheapening the one genuine act of grace he had received in years. With a slow, deliberate shake of her head, Clara took a step back, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional one now yawning between them. The hope he had offered felt like a gilded cage, a beautiful prison, where she would forever be known as the CEO's pet project, the living embodiment of his newfound corporate soul. She would not be a parable. Her struggle was her own, her dignity was her own, and it wasn't for sale. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Harrison," she said, the formal title a clear and painful dismissal of the connection they had shared. "But I can't accept." She turned, her shoulders squared with a resolve born of humiliation and a fierce need to reclaim her own story. She began to walk toward the heavy office door, each step an assertion of her independence, choosing the terrifying uncertainty of her old life over the compromised security of his new one. He watched her go, a wave of panic rising in his chest that was eerily similar to the one he'd felt on the side of the road. He was losing something far more valuable than a potential employee. He was losing the one person who had reminded him what it meant to be human. Her rejection wasn't an insult. It was a lesson, a harsh and necessary one. He had tried to fix her problem with power, when all she wanted was for her sacrifice to be seen and respected for what it was. As her hand closed around the cold, brass handle of the door, a portal back to the world that had discarded her, he found his voice. "Clara, wait!" he called out, the name stripped of all corporate authority, leaving only the raw plea of one person to another. The sound hung in the air, a fragile bridge over the chasm of pride and misunderstanding, leaving her with one final choice. Clara's hand froze on the cold brass doorknob, the finality of her departure held in suspense by his raw, unadorned plea. She turned slowly, her heart a tumultuous sea of pride and a burgeoning, unwilling empathy. Arthur took a hesitant step forward, the vast distance of the office floor feeling like a desolate chasm between them. The mask of the CEO was gone, stripped away to reveal the same haunted, vulnerable man from the rain-soaked curb. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet and heavy, with a sincerity that resonated more than any corporate decree. "I was wrong. I took your beautiful, selfless act and tried to put a price tag on it. I tried to solve a human problem with a business solution, and in doing so, I insulted the very thing I came to admire. I am so sorry." He wasn't speaking to an employee. He was speaking to the one person who had seen him at his absolute weakest and had not turned away. He moved closer, not to intimidate, but to share a burden, his eyes pleading for her to understand the depth of what she had done. "What you don't know," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "is that this wasn't the first time I stood on a rainy street, helpless, with a wife in labor." He recounted the story of a decade past, of a different car, a different wife, and a cold, indifferent city that had offered no help. He spoke of the baby they lost that day, a grief that had hollowed him out and filled him with a bitter cynicism that had poisoned everything, including the company he built. "When my car died last week, I wasn't just scared," he confessed. A tear tracing a path down his cheek. "I was reliving the worst day of my life, certain the world would prove its cruelty to me once again. And then you stopped. You, Clara. You answered a prayer I didn't even have the faith to whisper anymore." The story settled over Clara, a profound and heartbreaking truth that instantly extinguished the last embers of her anger. The ice around her heart didn't just melt, it shattered. She saw him then, not as a billionaire in a tower, but as a man carrying a wound so deep it had shaped his entire existence. Her small act of kindness hadn't just been a ride to the hospital, it had been a miracle, a direct counterpoint to his greatest tragedy. All the perceived injustice, the humiliation, the corporate maneuvering, it all dissolved into a wave of pure, unadulterated compassion that mirrored what she had felt for him in her car. Her hand fell away from the doorknob, her posture softening as she finally, truly saw the man in front of her. She had saved more than a baby. She had saved a man's soul from drowning in a decade of grief. Arthur saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, and he took one final, hopeful breath. "I'm not offering you a job as a reward," he clarified, his tone earnest and transformed. "I'm asking for your help. This company has become a reflection of my cynicism, cold, efficient, and unforgiving. The manager who fired you was simply enforcing the culture I created. You showed me how broken that is. I don't want to give you your old job back. I want to create a new position for you as a director of employee welfare to help me tear down this broken system and rebuild it with the same compassion you showed me. I need you, Clara, not as a symbol, but as a partner. Help me build a company that is worthy of people like you. A place where no one is ever punished for their humanity." A profound silence filled the room, broken only by the distant, muted sounds of the city below. Clara looked from Arthur's sincere, waiting face to the panoramic window. Outside, a sliver of determined sunlight finally pierced through the heavy grey clouds, casting a warm, golden light across the cityscape and into the office. It was a promise of a new day. In that moment, she understood. This wasn't about a job. It was about a mission. It was a chance to turn her painful sacrifice into a force for genuine change, to ensure the kindness that had almost cost her everything would now be the foundational principle of thousands of other lives. A slow, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time that day. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I will help you." 6 months later, the city awoke not to a weeping grey sky, but to a brilliant, unapologetic sunrise that painted the skyscrapers in hues of gold and rose. Clara's mornings were no longer a frantic race against a ticking clock, a desperate scramble for survival. Instead, they began with a quiet cup of coffee, watching the light spill across the living room floor where her son played, his laughter the new soundtrack to her life. Her drive to work was calm, a journey of purpose rather than panic. She walked into the same building that had once dismissed her, but now she entered not as a cog in a machine, but as its heart. She was greeted with genuine smiles from colleagues who now saw the company not just as a place of work, but as a community that cared, a place where their humanity was seen as its greatest asset. The air itself felt different, lighter, filled with a nascent and powerful hope. Her new office, with its warm lighting and open door, was a sanctuary for those who had previously felt invisible. She championed policies that recognized employees as people first, flexible hours for single parents, emergency leave for family crises, and mental health support that was more than just a pamphlet. She remembered the cold, impersonal dismissal she had received and vowed no one else would ever be made to feel so small. One afternoon, a young man, his eyes red-rimmed with worry, confessed he needed to leave early because his father was in the hospital. Instead of pointing to a rule book, Clara simply placed a gentle hand on his arm and told him to go, to be with his family, and to not worry about anything else. In that small gesture, the soul of the entire corporation was being reborn, one act of compassion at a time. It is a profound truth of the universe that our greatest setbacks often conceal our most significant turning points. We navigate our lives by a map of our own making, fearing any deviation from the planned route, panicking at every unexpected delay. But destiny has its own geography, a landscape where the quickest path is not always the straightest. Sometimes, what feels like a catastrophic detour is, in fact, the universe gently guiding you onto the very road you were always meant to travel. Clara believed she was driving toward the end of her career that rainy morning, but she was actually heading directly toward her true calling. Her delay wasn't a failure, it was an appointment with fate, a necessary pause that allowed the right path to finally reveal itself, proving that the moments that seem to break us are often the ones that make us whole. One sunny Saturday, Clara sat on a park bench beside Arthur, his wife, and a cooing baby Grace, whose tiny hand was wrapped securely around Clara's finger. They were no longer CEO and employee, rescuer and victim. They were simply friends, a makeshift family forged in a moment of shared panic and grace. They watched her son and Arthur's older children play together, their laughter mingling with the gentle breeze. The quiet joy of the moment was a testament to the ripple effect of a single choice. How many lives had been touched because one woman decided to stop her car? It's a powerful reminder that we are all connected in ways we can't always see. If this story of how a single act of kindness rewrote a destiny has touched your heart, consider sharing it so that its light of hope and compassion can travel even further into the world. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long, peaceful shadows across the park, Clara felt a sense of contentment so deep it settled in her very bones. She watched her son, his face alight with pure, unadulterated joy, and knew that everything she had fought for, every risk she had taken, was worth it. Her life was no longer defined by the struggle to survive, but by the quiet, profound fulfillment of helping others thrive. She had learned that kindness is not a weakness in a world that values strength, but is, in fact, the most powerful force of all. It is a currency that enriches both the giver and the receiver, a light that can pierce the darkest storm, and a simple choice that holds the magnificent, undeniable power to change everything, rewriting our stories with endings more beautiful than we ever could have dared to imagine.